Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. This is Dr. Blakeney. I'm just south of Charleston, South Carolina, where the Civil War began, and I'm at the McLeod Plantation, which was active before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after. At the beginning of the Civil War, there were 74 slaves here, and they lived in these houses back here, which you can see, and they worked these fields over here. Right now, this whole area represents about 37 acres, and before there were about 1,400 acres. And they would primarily farm Sea Island cotton, which you can see an example of just in front of me. That's Sea Island cotton. It grows about 8 feet tall, where other cotton only grows to about waist high. And so that's what made it so valuable here. It was worth many times more what average cotton was for. And so this plantation itself in South Carolina, I believe, was the highest producing, as far as money goes, cotton plantation in the area at least. And so let's go back to the history real quick. Before 1860, it was all the labor was done by the 74 slaves that lived here, primarily through Sea Island cotton, but they also had many farm animals, poultry, etc., dairy, which they would also use to make money. During the Civil War, this started off, the owner was sent to Virginia. This plantation here became part of the Confederate Army's headquarters for defending Charleston, South Carolina, and it would stay that way all the way through the end of the war, when in 1865 the Union troops came over and took it over. After the Civil War, Lincoln guaranteed 40 acres and a mule for all freed slaves, and so that's what happened here. This became the headquarters of the Freedmen's Bureau, and the families that lived here were given some land. However, unfortunately, when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson, who was a Southerner, decided that maybe if people went up to the White House and they literally signed a document saying that they were loyal to the United States, they'd give them their land back. So this land was kind of in dispute for a couple years, but then it eventually went back to the McLeods. They farmed it for a while. The Sea Island cotton, which I was talking about just a minute ago, was taken over by the boll weevil, and so the cotton no longer was in existence. They thought this variety was extinct, but then they found some in Texas and brought it back. That's why we have examples of it today. So that's what the actual cotton looks like. That's what it looks like before it comes out of in bloom. And let's see if we can find some flowers here. I don't see any here. So working this was super difficult. You basically had one of 3 jobs if you were a slave. Actually 4. If you were a child, you did whatever you could to help out. That might mean making bricks. So oftentimes when you see bricks built before the Civil War, regardless of where you are in the United States, you're going to see that there's little handprints on it, because they had to turn the bricks all the time, 3 or 4 times a day, as they dried out. And so kids could do that. They'd also have other small jobs. Once you hit puberty, if you were a boy, you would take over a job like you might end up working as a blacksmith, or working with some of the animals, or a carpenter. This house was built by slaves, so those types of jobs. And the worst jobs were reserved for women in several ways. Slavery, you could no longer import slaves starting in 1808, and so females were expected to have a child every year, and they would have a child throughout their pregnancy. They worked in the fields, the cotton fields, whatever they were doing, and they ended up just working all the way through their pregnancy. On the day they had birth, they were expected to be back in the fields that day, working just after giving birth, with a child bound to them with a cloth or something like that. Picking cotton is really difficult. Lots of thorns. The ground there is filled with fire ants, so you had to deal with fire ants, getting your hands ripped up, getting your clothes ripped up. You'd have to mend those at night. You'd have to take care of your family at home by cooking a meal. If you were breastfeeding, you'd breastfeed your child once in the morning, then once when you got back. And so women had a much lower life expectancy than men. I think the average was 47 to 52 years old, the tour guide told us. And not only that, if you lived longer than that, then you would take care of the young children that other women were having while they were out in the fields. So not a very good life at all for any slaves. Real briefly, I want to talk about what happened after slavery ended. So once slavery ended, the former slaves here had land for a little bit, then it was taken back. But then what the McLeod family did, and what many Southern farmers did, is they started the Black Codes, which would eventually become the Jim Crow laws. And these laws basically stated that if separate laws for black people and white people, and so if you were black and you did some offense like throwing trash on the ground or not stepping aside for a white person as you're walking down the street, you could be put in prison for 30 to 50 years. But there was a clause in the 13th Amendment that said if you are in prison, you can go out and work. And that actually still is in existence today in some parts of the country where prisoners will go out and work while they're actually in prison. But even more likely, you wouldn't be put in prison. You'd still live in the same house you did as when you were a slave, but you would also, now you would be rented the land, and that land would be given, you'd farm the same fields that you farmed before. You couldn't afford to buy tools, you couldn't afford to buy fertilizer, you couldn't afford to buy the seeds. So where do you think you got that? You'd get that from the former slave owners, who would sell it to you for 2 or 3 times its value, and then they would buy your crops for much less than they could sell them for. So you ended up working all year, not making anything. In fact, you might go into more debt. And then if you went into more debt, you wouldn't be able to leave, so you'd have to stay, and you would get in more and more debt. So this system lasted all the way on this farm up until I believe the 1960s. And actually in these little houses down here, which I'll show you a picture of, you had families living here all the way through 1990 when they were finally asked to leave by the McLeod family when one of the siblings died at 104. So that's kind of the story of life on this plantation. There were hundreds, if not thousands of them in the South, and we still have remnants of the legacy of slavery happening today with tenant farmers and prisoners working on different agricultural projects or different projects for the governments while they are in prison. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Sorry it was a little bit long, but I think it's an important topic, and I will see you in the classroom soon. Take care. Bye-bye.